So as we all know, the video game industry sure is a tough business. It can be tricky to predict what players will respond to, and there's never a guarantee that a quality game will turn out both as a critical and commercial success. And failure can mean different things depending on the circumstance. A game might get panned by reviewers and fail to sell, or sell well despite poor reviews, yet fail to prove itself worthy of a wider franchise. And yet, the 10 failed video games that we're talking about today saw publishers and developers performing extreme feats of mental gymnastics in an attempt to explain why their new releases reviewed poorly, fell short of sales projections, or both. So let's take a look at them. As I'm Jules, this is WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 ridiculous reasons that games were blamed for failing. Number 10. World War II fatigue. Call of Duty Vanguard. The latest Call of Duty received some of the weakest reviews in the series' history and failed to meet Activision's sales expectations, prompting them to blame the commercial underperformance on the game's World War II time period. In their recent annual investors report, Activision said the 1940s setting didn't resonate with some of our community. Yet, with the World War II shooter becoming an increasingly crowded space, it really felt like a convenient place to plant the blame. After all, the primary criticisms of Vanguard had nothing to do with the time period that it took place in, but rather the short and unremarkable campaign, embarrassingly lackluster zombie mode, and standard fare multiplayer suite. Simply, there wasn't much of an incentive to pay top dollar for another garden variety Call of Duty game that didn't present a unique experience when they could just play Warzone for free instead. World War II themed games are still performing well outside of Vanguard, so it's clearly more of a problem with this specific game rather than the setting. It seems that oversaturating the audience while failing to offer majorly compelling content is the real issue here. Number 9. Too much RPG competition. Mass Effect Andromeda. Mass Effect Andromeda certainly had one hell of a rough launch, with critics and players alike lambasting its array of technical issues, comically janky facial animations, and uneven story. Though ultimately a commercial success, analysts widely perceived it as underperforming compared to the top 2 prior games in the series. Longtime BioWare employee Mark Dara, who worked on the game, attempted to carry out some damage control shortly after release, claiming that Andromeda suffered primarily from releasing in a crowded market. Mark said, "I think that came out at a really busy window in March, perhaps the busiest window in the history of the gaming industry, where 5 RPGs released in the same month. It came out in the same month as Zelda." Yet it's difficult to see where he's coming from in finding 5 RPGs released within the same month as Andromeda. I mean, yes, The Legend of Zelda: The Breath of the Wild and Nier Automata, potato patata, did release, but the slate wasn't nearly as crammed as he suggested. More to the point, Mass Effect is a hugely popular IP, and had it been up to the expected standard, there's absolutely no chance that it would have markedly underperformed against anything. Number 8. Developers not working hard enough. OVERKILL'S The Walking Dead. If all else fails, just blame the developers themselves, right? Well, that's what OVERKILL Software ex-CEO Bo Anderson did when OVERKILL'S The Walking Dead was a critical and commercial flop way back in 2018. When Anderson resigned as CEO in the wake of the game's failure, he sent a final email to the dev team making his feelings on the matter abundantly and horrendously clear. "Personally, though I lost all my money, my family in divorce, and my kids' custody through the toil over the last 2 to 3 years working 100-hour weeks for Starbreeze and keeping you devs paid and in the game, with less and less developers willing to put in the extra care in a product, it clearly limits the possible result of enough quality in time." Anderson was widely criticized for this email, which ran counter to claims from the developers that they were fighting with an awkward engine from the very start of development, and had worked intense crunch periods leading up to the game's release. The project was also characterized as mismanaged and damaged by a creeping scope, making it clear that there simply wasn't a coherent, confident vision for the game from the higher-ups, rather than its failure being the fault of the employees just doing the programming, art, sound design, and so on. Number 7. Halo Infinite's very polished multiplayer launch. Battlefield 2042. Battlefield 2042 released late last year to aggressively mixed reviews that were by far the mainline series' worst to date, while players were considerably more vitriolic, loudly lamenting the abundance of bugs, lack of launch content, and removal of classic franchise features. A petition demanding players be granted refunds across all platforms is currently sitting on 230,000 plus signatures, indicating just how dissatisfied players were en masse with a product that was clearly rushed out of the door to appease shareholders in the pre-holiday period. Responding to the lackluster reception, both critically and commercially, EA not only blamed pandemic-related production constraints, a convenient excuse for any subpar title of this era, but boldly declared Halo Infinite's surprise multiplayer launch as instrumental in Battlefield 2042's downfall. Infinite's multiplayer suite unexpectedly launched 4 days before Battlefield 2042's release, and in a town hall meeting held back in February, EA said that Infinite's very polished state was not a favorable comparison to Battlefield. Battlefield. Really, the pandemic excuse was a lot more persuasive than blaming the competition for simply putting out a more compelling and admittedly free alternative. Number 6. PC piracy. Unreal Tournament 3. Once upon a time, Unreal was an absolute juggernaut of a tentpole FPS franchise, scoring both rave reviews from critics and strong sales. But then Unreal Tournament 3 was released for PC and consoles in 2007, and despite solid reviews, absolutely died commercially on PC, selling just 33,995 copies in almost an entire month of release. A few years later, in 2010, developer Epic Games blamed the underperformance of several of their games on piracy, a claim which might have seemed more persuasive had Unreal Tournament 3 posted gangbusters sales on PS3 and Xbox 360. And yet the game ultimately limped over the 1 million sales line, shifting barely half of what 1999's legendary Unreal Tournament sold years earlier, despite its console release getting a massive marketing push. Furthermore, the primary attraction of the Unreal Tournament games is undeniably the online multiplayer, which piracy would largely have locked players out of anyway. In reality, Unreal Tournament 3 failed to connect for a number of reasons. Its muddy, dark art style, lack of launch content, lackluster campaign, and the general feeling that it didn't offer enough of a leap from Unreal Tournament 2004. With Halo dominating the sci-fi FPS space at this point in time, it just wasn't good enough, and players summarily voted with their wallets. Piracy is an all-too-convenient boogeyman on which the publishers regularly try to hang their own failures. Number 5. It was too woke. Lawbreakers. Lawbreakers was an attempt by legendary Epic Games developer Cliffy B to break into the hero shooter genre, which received broadly positive reviews yet failed to hit commercially, resulting in its player base falling off a cliff in the months following release. Less than a year after the game's summer 2017 bow, Blazinski's Boss Key Productions label was dissolved, and a few months later Lawbreakers servers were switched off. The game's failure clearly frustrated Blazinski, who later claimed it suffered from him making it too woke. In a rather deranged statement, he said, "One big epiphany I had was that I pushed my own personal political beliefs in a world that was increasingly divided. Instead of the story being, this game looks neat, it became this game with the woke bro trying to push his hacky productions on us with gender-neutral bathrooms. Instead of these characters seem fun, it was, this is the studio with the CEO who refuses to make his female characters sexier. Instead of who am I going to choose, it became white dude shoehorns diversity in his game and then smells his own smug farts in interviews instead of just letting the product speak for itself. It's okay to be political when your company or studio is established for great product first, but we were unproven and I regret doing it." Yet the game being diverse or woke really had nothing to do with its failure. The biggest strike against Lawbreakers is that compared to similarly themed games like Overwatch, its heroes simply didn't have particularly distinct aesthetics or personalities. No hero shooter can succeed without iconic characters, and so it wasn't long before players lost interest in the game and its white bread roster. Number 4. Anomalous reviews. Mafia 3. Believe it or not, Mafia 3 is actually the best-selling entry into the action-adventure franchise, shifting an impressive 7 million copies, a feat that's all the more laudable given the utter disinterest from critics. Mafia 3 received wildly mixed reviews for its repetitive missions and clunky gameplay, with the PC version being especially dinged for bugs and performance issues, as well as the fact that it was locked to a mere 30 FPS on launch. Ugh, disgusting. Despite solid sales, many fans of the series viewed the game as a huge disappointment compared to its predecessors, and so developer Hangar 13 ultimately put plans for Mafia 4 on the back burner. Shortly after Mafia 3's release, parent company Take-Two Interactive bizarrely blamed the game's reception on anomalies in the review process. In an earnings call, they said, "The scores are lower than we would have liked, but there are a lot of stellar reviews, and I think the most prominent reviewers really loved it, and recognized that what we're doing from the story, art, characters, and excitement perspective is really unmatched in the marketplace. So I think we and our competitors are seeing some anomalies in the reviews system." This was a thinly veiled attempt to put down any reviewers who had a bad word to say about the game, while claiming to shareholders that those that did praise the game were the biggest and most respected review outlets. It was a painfully transparent attempt to hand-wave mediocre reviews. Number 3. Players didn't like authentic combat. Medal of Honor Warfighter. Don't feel bad if you don't really remember Medal of Honor Warfighter, a near non-entity of an entry into the once celebrated FPS franchise that came and went with barely a peep back in 2012. Critics savaged the game for its confusing story, atrocious AI, generic gameplay, and unacceptable excess of bugs, while sales were poor in EA's own words, prompting them to put the franchise on ice where it's largely remained ever since. Despite this, then EA COO Peter Moore called the game solid and opined that it wasn't so much a quality issue as players failing to connect with what it was going for. Moore said that the focus on combat authenticity did not resonate with consumers, and even slung mud at critics for good measure, adding that review scores were frankly lower than deserved. Yikes. No, Peter, it was was just a poorly conceived game from the ground up, and one which, following a glut of franchise diluting mediocre offerings, was the straw that broke the camel's back, the camel being the consumer in this analogy, obviously. Number 2, people not buying it at full price. Days Gone. Though open-world zombie game Days Gone was a solid commercial hit for Sony, reviews were wildly mixed compared to almost all PlayStation's AAA first-party offerings of the period. This was reportedly a primary reason for Sony's decision not to proceed with a Days Gone sequel, which Ben's studio pitched to the publisher after the original's release. But the game's writer and co-director John Garvin ultimately felt that a sequel would have been produced regardless had the game sold more, and while appearing on a podcast, went on to blame frugal and budget-conscious gamers, stating, "I do have an opinion on something that your audience may find of interest, and it might piss some of them off. If you love a game, buy it at f***ing full price. I can't tell you how many times I've seen gamers say, yeah, I got that thing on sale, I got it through PS Plus, whatever." Obviously, decrying players who waited for a sale to play the game, a game that again received mixed reviews, is totally silly, and ignores the fact that Days Gone simply wasn't received as the high-caliber AAA title that PS4 owners were expecting. This doesn't mean that it's a bad game, because it isn't, but that Sony ultimately felt it clearly didn't have the makings of a franchise IP. And number 1, poor release timing. Homefront: The Revolution. If you can't come up with a genuine explanation for why your game cratered critically and commercially, just play the semantics card. That's what Deep Silver, the publisher of Homefront: The Revolution, did back in 2016 when the reboot sequel to 2011's forgettable FPS Homefront flopped with critics and general players. The publisher blamed the game's ill-timed release, and though you might assume that they were referring to a crowded calendar filled with hefty AAA competition, that's not it at all. Deep Silver said that they'd received considerably stronger feedback about the game since patching it in the months following its release, stating, "We're getting a lot of positive feedback compared to when we launched, so timing was probably the biggest lesson that we've learned here." What they really mean, but clearly didn't want to say out loud, is that the timing issue equates to releasing the game before it was even nearly ready. They rushed the game to market in the midst of a troubled development no less, and the results were unsurprisingly terrible. Then again, even with the various patches it received, Homefront: The Revolution is still far from a good game, and it's not exactly easy to believe that another year or two of development would have changed that. Sometimes it's just worth admitting that the game is bad, cutting your losses, and moving on. And there we go, my friends. Those were 10 ridiculous reasons games were blamed for failing. I hope that you enjoyed that, and please let me know what you thought about it down in the comments section below. As always, I've been Jules. You can go follow me over on Twitter at RetroJ0, or you can swing by Live and Let's Dice, where I do all of my streaming and Warhammer battle reports outside of work, and it'd be great to see you over there. But before I go, I just want to say one thing. Sometimes in life, we will all make mistakes, but you know what's really important? To not try and keep blaming ourselves for mistakes that we've made in the past. You deserve love, happiness, and success. And sometimes the only way that you're going to achieve those things is by accepting that you made bad decisions, but you have learned from them and are moving on in a better and healthier manner. And at the end of the day, that's all I want for you, is to live a healthy and happy life. So go out there and absolutely smash it, my friend. I believe in you. As always, I've been Jules. You have been awesome. Never forget that. And I'll speak to you soon. Bye.